The so-called East Coast-West Coast conflict of the 1990s is still considered one of the most dramatic and consequential chapters in the history of hip-hop. What originally began as a musical competition between two geographic centers developed within just a few years into an escalating feud that not only divided rap culture, but ultimately claimed the lives of two of its greatest stars. East Coast versus West Coast, New York versus Los Angeles, a conflict that went far beyond music and remains a cautionary tale to this day.
A rich man's world.
Hip-hop emerged in the 1970s on the East Coast of the United States, particularly in New York City. For many years, New York was regarded as the cultural and creative center of the movement. East Coast rap stood for complex rhyme schemes, hard beats, and a strong emphasis on authenticity and street reality. Toward the end of the 1980s, however, this balance of power began to shift. On the West Coast, especially in Los Angeles, a new sound was developing, heavily influenced by 1970s funk and deeply reflective of life shaped by gangs, violence, and survival. Artists such as N.W.A., Dr. Dre, and Snoop Dogg defined what became known as G-Funk, a style that achieved not only local success, but massive nationwide popularity. While the East Coast had long claimed to represent the true essence of hip-hop, the West Coast now dominated the charts, radio, and mainstream audiences. This shift created pride on one side and fear of losing relevance on the other, on both coasts.
A rich man's world.
As hip-hop's success grew, so did the pressure of competition. Major labels invested large sums of money, sales figures became more important than ever, and rap fully entered the mainstream. During this phase, regional identities began to harden. Early musical provocations appeared, such as in 1991, when New York rapper Tim Dog openly attacked the West Coast with the track "Fuck Compton." These attacks reflected growing frustration on the East Coast, while the West Coast increasingly saw itself as the new dominant force. At the same time, real-life street connections played a role. Both Los Angeles and New York had ties to gangs, adding a dangerous and very real dimension to the rivalry. What began as an artistic competition slowly transformed into a conflict driven by ego, power, and territorial pride.
A rich man's world.
At the center of the feud were two record labels that became symbolic of their respective coasts. On the West Coast, this was Death Row Records, founded by Dr. Dre and the notorious Suge Knight. Death Row dominated the scene with an aggressive image, enormous commercial success, and an aura of intimidation. Suge Knight portrayed himself as a powerful kingmaker with close ties to street culture. The label's most important artist became Tupac Shakur, who signed with Death Row in 1995 after his release from prison. Tupac was charismatic, highly intelligent, and deeply emotional. A man of contradictions who combined social criticism with raw anger and quickly became the voice of the West Coast. On the East Coast, Bad Boy Entertainment rose under the leadership of Sean Puff Daddy Combs. Bad Boy embraced a more glamorous, commercially polished image and introduced one of the greatest storytellers in rap history. The notorious B.I.G. Biggie's deep voice, effortless flow, and vivid depictions of life on the streets of Brooklyn made him the face of East Coast rap. Tragically, Tupac and Biggie were close friends at first. They supported each other, shared stages, and exchanged ideas. A bond whose collapse made the later conflict all the more devastating.
A rich man's world.
The definitive turning point came in November 1994. Tupac Shakur was shot multiple times in the lobby of a New York recording studio and narrowly survived the attack. While still in the hospital, Tupac became convinced that Biggie and members of the Bad Boy camp were involved. Although these accusations were never proven, they destroyed any remaining trust. Biggie and Puff Daddy denied all involvement, but for Tupac, the sense of betrayal was real. When Biggie released the song Who Shot Ya shortly afterward, Tupac perceived it as a direct provocation and a mockery of his injuries. From that moment on, the conflict was open, personal, and public.
A rich man's world.
In 1995 and 1996, the beef escalated dramatically. At the 1995 Source Awards, Suge Knight used the stage to publicly insult Puff Daddy. The crowd reacted loudly, tensions ran high, and for the first time the East-West conflict played out on a national stage. Violence soon spread beyond the spotlight as members of both camps became involved in street confrontations. The musical peak of this escalation came in 1996 with Tupac's diss track, Hit 'Em Up. The song was brutal, direct, and uncompromising, filled with insults, accusations, and explicit threats. At this point, it was clear that the conflict was no longer just about music.
A rich man's world.
The media played a decisive role in pushing the conflict even further. Hip-hop magazines, television networks, and radio stations portrayed the feud as an all-out war between the East and West coasts. Fans were divided into camps. Every lyric was analyzed for hidden messages, and music videos reinforced a sense of territorial hostility. Often overlooked was the fact that many prominent rappers deliberately stayed out of the beef, and that at its core, the conflict was primarily between two labels. Still, the constant media amplification created an atmosphere in which violence seemed almost inevitable.
A rich man's world.
On September 7, 1996, Tupac Shakur was critically wounded in a drive-by shooting in Las Vegas. 6 days later, he died in the hospital at the age of 25. The hip-hop world was left in shock. Less than a year later, in March 1997, the notorious B.I.G. was shot and killed in Los Angeles in another drive-by attack. He was only 24 years old. Both murders remain officially unsolved to this day and have generated countless theories, speculations, and myths. With their deaths, not only did two camps lose their leaders, the entire culture lost two extraordinary talents.
A rich man's world.
After the murders, a period of reflection followed. Artists called for de-escalation, public gestures of reconciliation emerged, and the East Coast-West Coast conflict gradually lost its significance. Death Row Records fell apart, while the hip-hop landscape opened up geographically. The South and the Midwest gained influence, and new sounds came to the forefront. Tupac and Biggie became legends whose music continues to resonate today. The conflict of the 1990s remains a powerful warning of how dangerous it can be when artistic rivalry, power, media hype, and real street conflicts collide. At the same time, it represents a period of immense creativity whose impact is still deeply felt in hip-hop culture.